This is a reading of Written in Bone, Buried Lives in Jamestown by Sally Walker, Chapter 8, Part 2. So the picture on page 114 has a caption that says, HK9 was missing the skull, but the rest of the bones were in good shape. They helped researchers identify him as a man who died around age 60 in the early 1700s. Without the skull, though, they couldn't tell what his ancestry was. Page 115 has a picture and the caption says, HK7 above, found near HK9, told a different story. So let's read and find out about this headless man. Meanwhile, Brown continued to excavate XK9, the other coffin in the grave shaft. The remains had been placed inside with care. The skeleton's legs and feet were straight, the arms lay alongside the body, and the hands had been positioned across the pelvis. Imagine then how startled Brown was when he cleared away the soil at the head end of the coffin where he expected to find the skull. Instead, he found a third puzzle. The skull was missing. Where could it be? Had this individual been beheaded? Careful interpretation of the coffin's remains and clues from the soil solved the mystery. The infant's coffin actually lay inside part of HK9's coffin. The only way the small coffin could have ended up within the large one was if the infant had been buried at a later time, after HK9's coffin had begun to decompose. It seems likely that the people burying the baby were unaware of the location of the previous grave. By accident, the grave diggers had disturbed the head of HK9's grave and dislodged the skull. Brown and Brewelhide excavated more soil from the area around the end of HK9's coffin. They found one tooth, a molar, so they knew that the skull had been there, but there was no further trace of it. The skull's whereabouts remain a mystery. HK9's bones, while showing evidence of age, were in fairly sturdy condition. Some of the smaller bones had been decayed somewhat, and the right clavicle had been broken in two some time after burial. Other bones had scratch-like marks on them, etchings made by roots that grew into the coffin. The robust quality of the long bones and the pelvic bones enabled Brewelhide to determine the skeleton had belonged to a man. That he was an adult was also apparent. The efficies of his long bones were completely fused, and on the edges of some of his vertebrae had lipping, the bone spurs caused by arthritis. Together, these signs indicated that the man had been about 60 years old or older when he died. The hopes that Harley Knoll burials would date to the 17th century dimmed when Brown and Brewelhide found a brass button among the man's remains. They knew that it was unlikely that the person in the 1600s would have been buried in clothes. Furthermore, the button resembled others they had seen that dated to the 1700s. More detailed study of the button would have been necessary to confirm their suspicion. Another surprise. A skeleton designated as Harley Knoll Burial 7, HK7, had been uncovered several feet away from HK9. The well-preserved coffin, whose narrow shape suggested that the remains placed inside had belonged to a person of slight stature, perfectly illustrated how a coffin breaks apart when it decays. As the wide, flat lid decomposes, it weakens until it can no longer support the weight of the soil lying on top of it. The lid collapses inwards on top of the skeleton. That's exactly what Dana Coleman found as she excavated HK7's coffin. In fact, the skull was still covered by large pieces of the lid. As eager as she was to see the skeleton that lay beneath, Coleman left the wood in place on top of the skull. She continued brushing dirt from the coffin until the entire lid was exposed. We need to make sure that we had adequate photographs, measurements, and sketches before the coffin wood was removed. Coleman explained. Finally, Coleman removed the wood and exposed the skeleton. She expected to find the remains of a person who had come from Europe, most likely England. After all, the majority of Chesapeake colonists were English. The sight of the skull, however, immediately turned the assumption upside down. I suspected that the person was not European once I saw the face, Coleman recalled. There were features of the mid-face that were consistent with an individual of African ancestry. Ousley's examination of HK7's skull confirmed Coleman's suspicion. The angle of the front jaw, the rounded forehead, the broad nasal opening were consistent with those of a person of African heritage. So the picture on page 116, the caption tells us, the shape of the skull gave archaeologist Dana Coleman, below on the left, the clue that the person was of African ancestry. On page 117, the picture tells us, though Coleman hadn't expected to find a person of African ancestry, she wasn't terribly surprised. By the late 1600s, people from Africa were working throughout the Chesapeake region. So this part of the text says, from African shores. Ousley and his team knew that HK7 was far from the first person of African heritage to live in the Maryland colony. According to the historical record, that distinction belongs to Matthias de Souza, the first known documented person of African heritage to arrive in the colony of Maryland. Although he is mentioned by name is only in a few documents, historians had been able to piece together some understanding of his life and standing in the colony. Thought to be the son of an African woman and a Portuguese man, de Souza arrived in 1634 as the indentured servant, not the slave, of Father White, a Catholic priest. De Souza became a trader and a sailor. He was very active in the St. Mary's city community and eventually served in the Legislative Assembly. As an assembly member, he likely voted on proposed laws for the colony. This means he may have been the first person of African ancestry to vote in America. By 1650, several hundred people of African ancestry lived in the Chesapeake area. Some were indentured servants, some were slaves, and some were free people. Regardless of their social status, the new arrivals became significant members of the colony workforce. During most of the 17th century, white servants, and black slaves worked side by side on plantations, doing similar tasks. Most shared living quarters as well. During most of this time, free black colonists had legal rights similar to those of white colonists. Court records in Virginia and Maryland prove that at least some Africans and African Americans brought grievances to the legal system and won their cases. Gradually, however, Africans and their descendants were stripped of their rights as harsh new laws concerning slavery were passed. By 1700, slavery had become firmly established in the Chesapeake area. The thousands of Africans who were forcibly brought from Africa to Maryland and Virginia colonies as slaves were regarded by law as property that could be bought and sold for life. When a female slave had a child, the child was considered a slave too. This meant that their supply of future workers increased with each birth. Increasingly, landowners found it more advantageous to own slaves rather than to pay to bring servant workers from England. By the 1720s, slave labor had become the main workforce. The colonial graves that Owsley's crew excavated at Harley Knoll contained the remains of 4 children whose ancestry could not be definitely determined. 6 adults of African ancestry, including HK7, 1 person of European ancestry, and 1 person of unknown heritage, HK9, whose ancestry remains unknown since his skull could not be examined. At this point in the investigation, no one could determine whether the colonists buried on Harley Knoll were servants, slave, or free people. Their bones can't supply the answer. Perhaps another piece of evidence would emerge as the team continued its work. On page 118, there's a picture, and the picture says, "Not all the people of African ancestry living in Maryland at the time were slaves. Matthias de Souza, for example, arrived in the colony as an indentured servant, but eventually won his freedom. He was active in life around St. Mary's City and served in its legislature. His name, listed as Matt das Souza, 3rd name left column, on this legislative document is part of the historical record."